Correlation does not equal causation. 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 Okay, so this is obviously another mantra that you should take away from the class. Just because there appears to be a relationship between two variables doesn't mean that you can determine cause and effect. In addition to establishing a relationship between variables, you also need to have a temporal precedence of the independent variable before the dependent variable, and a lack of plausible alternative explanations. You need to control for potentially confounding variables. With non-experimental research, you can establish evidence for a relationship between variables, and sometimes, but not always, you can establish a temporal precedence of the independent variable before the dependent variable. However, whereas in experimental and non-experimental designs the researcher has some kind of control over the independent variable, in non-experimental research the variable can't be manipulated. Because of this limitation, it's impossible to rule out any kind of alternate explanations. So to repeat, just because we find evidence that one variable systematically varies with another doesn't mean that one actually causes the other to change. In fact, it might not even mean that they're related. When we find a coincidental correlation, this is called spurious. For instance, one of the famous correlations is a link between pirates and global warming. Over the years, the number of pirates has gone down, and at the same time, global temperatures have gone up. Now, even if there seems to be a pattern here, logically these two things are not related. A few other things that are correlated. Per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. The divorce rate in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine. The number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool and the films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. Nobody's going to claim that Nicolas Cage is causing, swimming pool drownings.
Balls and squeak. Smoked eel pie. Sheriff. Hi, guys!
I'm a vampire.
I'm like a prickly pear.
See you in life. I'm a vampire.
Okay, let's
Order. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Huh?
So there are two types of non-experimental studies, and these fall under the categories of causal comparative and correlational studies. In the text it calls them first and second simple cases of non-experimental quantitative research. I've never heard that term before getting this text, and that sounds really kind of confusing and awkward to say. Instead, most of the researchers that I've come across use the terms causal comparative and correlational, and typically correlational. Now, as the textbook notes, the difference between these two types of research is the kind of independent variable that you have in your study, either a categorical or a continuous variable. If you have a categorical variable, it's causal comparative. If you have a continuous or quantitative variable, then you're looking at a correlational study. Correlation is often noted as a lowercase r, and the strength of a correlation ranges from 0 to 1. Generally speaking, different fields have different sort of standards for this, but in general, anything below 0.3 is considered a weak correlation, and anything above 0.7 is considered a strong correlation. And obviously whatever is between is just moderate. And correlations can also have directions, positive or negative correlations. In a positive correlation, as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable also increases. And in a negative correlation, as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable actually decreases. When you have no correlation, then your data points are just going to be scattered all over the place. Now the text actually breaks things down into time and objective dimensions of research. The time dimension of non-experimental research kind of seems pretty straightforward. Either you're looking at a phenomenon at a particular point in time, which is cross-sectional research, or you're going to examine it over a long period of time, or longitudinal research. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, is with cross-sectional research, what you find true today may not necessarily be true tomorrow. People change, cultures change, ideas change. Sometimes what you might need to do is replicate a cross-sectional study again over a period of time, just to make sure that the findings remain stable. And sometimes it can be worthwhile to go back to some older studies and try and replicate them in a modern context. Is Bloom's taxonomy still relevant in today's educational system? Now, longitudinal studies, of course, look at changes across time. And because they take so long to do, they don't often require, replication. Except maybe in different contexts. If I did a longitudinal study in the US, would I find the same things in a longitudinal study in, let's say, the UK? Now, the drawback to doing a longitudinal study is that they're more prone to, history and maturation effects, which could introduce a lot of potentially confounding variables. And, of course, they take a long time to do. So doing a cross-sectional study gives researchers a quicker payoff in terms of publication, and they can actually do more of them in the span of time it would take to do a longitudinal study. So you don't see too many longitudinal studies. And then the text also breaks it down into an objective dimension as well. So let's start by saying this. In quantitative research, descriptive non-experimental research is pretty much the lowest level of any kind of research that you can do. Essentially what it is polling. You're looking at frequencies and you're looking at percentages, and that's about it. You're not determining cause-effect. You're not even looking at a relationship between variables. You just want to know what's going on in the world. Now, these studies can still provide some valuable information. So, for example, the U.S. Census is a descriptive study. It's a massive descriptive study, but that's all it is. The Pew Research Center that we go to for some statistics and things, they do this kind of work as well. So it has some merit, and it can be very helpful in informing policies. But from an academic perspective, if all you're doing is kind of counting things and calculating percentages, you're not going to go too far. It doesn't really take that much skill. So predictive research is better because now we're looking at the relationship between variables. Can I predict what's going to happen in the future by what I see happening now? The GRE is a kind of predictive test. We see a correlation between test scores and performance in graduate school, but obviously we give the test before you get admitted to graduate school rather than after. But as I mentioned in another video, I think, nobody would actually claim that the GRE causes performance in graduate school. Rather, it's related to a third variable being your aptitude. Nevertheless, we can use the GRE as a predictor for your performance in graduate school. So predictive studies can allow you to predict the future. And then finally you have explanatory designs, such as structural equation modeling. And I know that sounds really intimidating, and a lot of people's heads start to swim when they come across articles with SEM or structural equation modeling. But if you look at the diagrams on page 411, 412, they're not really that hard to understand. Basically, you're looking at a relatively complex phenomenon with multiple independent variables, and you're attempting to understand how they all correlate with each other and work together to influence each other and to influence the dependent variable. Now, if you remember the second chapter, we talked about mediating and moderating variables. That's what we're looking at here with the SEM. And we're looking at all of the different relationships between all of these different variables. So doing SEM work can be pretty complex, but you shouldn't be intimidated by reading SEM articles. All they are is sort of an explanation of how a complex phenomenon is operating. And that pretty much wraps it up for Chapter 14.